It was a fear that most people could not see, but one they could feel every day. Newspapers, television broadcasts, school drills, political speeches, and military parades all carried the same underlying message. At any moment, the world could change forever. Two superpowers stood at the center of this tension, each armed with thousands of nuclear weapons capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. And yet, despite this overwhelming danger, these two powers never fought each other directly. This long and uneasy period of global tension became known as the Cold War. The Cold War was not a single event, nor was it a traditional war with clear battlefields and formal declarations. Instead, it was a global struggle that influenced nearly every country on Earth. On one side was the United States, along with its allies in Western Europe, parts of Asia, and other regions. On the other side was the Soviet Union and the nations aligned with it. These two sides represented completely different political, economic, and social systems. The conflict between them shaped international relations, national identities, and everyday life for millions of people across several generations. Unlike previous global conflicts, the Cold War was rarely fought through direct military confrontation between the main rivals. American and Soviet soldiers almost never faced each other on a battlefield. Instead, the struggle played out through indirect means: political pressure, economic competition, propaganda, intelligence operations, technological races, and the constant threat of nuclear weapons all became tools of conflict. Wars still happened, but they were often fought by other countries supported by one superpower or the other. These conflicts became known as proxy wars, and they turned local struggles into global crises. At the heart of the Cold War was a deep ideological divide. The United States was built on the ideas of capitalism, democracy, and individual freedoms. Its system emphasized private property, free markets, and political pluralism. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was founded on communism. It promoted a one-party political system, state ownership of major industries, and the idea that economic equality was more important than individual competition. Each side believed its system was superior, not just for itself, but for the entire world. Both believed that history was moving in their favor, and the eventual triumph of their system was inevitable. This belief made compromise extremely difficult. Any gain by one side was seen as a loss by the other. Political movements, economic reforms, or revolutions in distant countries were often interpreted through the lens of the Cold War. If a government leaned toward communism, the United States worried about the spread of Soviet influence. If a country aligned with the West, the Soviet Union feared encirclement and loss of security. Over time, this mindset created a world where almost every international issue became part of a larger, more dangerous rivalry. To understand how this situation developed, it is necessary to return to the aftermath of World War II. That war had left much of the world in ruins. Entire cities across Europe and Asia were destroyed by bombing and ground combat. Millions of soldiers and civilians had lost their lives. Economies were shattered, infrastructure was broken, and political systems had collapsed. Amid this devastation, two countries emerged as dominant global powers: the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States ended World War II with its economy stronger than ever. Its industrial base was intact, its cities were untouched by war, and its military had grown into one of the most powerful in history. The Soviet Union, although it had suffered enormous losses, emerged with a massive army and significant political influence across Eastern Europe. The Red Army had pushed Nazi forces back across the continent, and in doing so, it had established a strong Soviet presence in many countries. During the war, the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies. They cooperated out of necessity to defeat a common enemy. However, this alliance was always uneasy. Even as they fought together, both sides distrusted each other's intentions. The United States worried about Soviet expansion and authoritarian control. The Soviet Union remembered past invasions from the West and feared future attacks. When the war ended and the common enemy disappeared, these tensions quickly resurfaced. One of the key issues after World War II was the future of Europe. The continent was weak, divided, and vulnerable. The United States believed that economic recovery and political stability were essential to prevent future conflicts. To achieve this, it launched the Marshall Plan, a massive program designed to rebuild European economies. The plan offered financial aid to countries willing to cooperate with the United States and adopt market-based reforms. American leaders believed that prosperity would reduce the appeal of communism and create strong, stable allies. The Soviet Union viewed the Marshall Plan very differently. Soviet leaders saw it as an attempt to expand American influence and undermine communist movements in Europe. As a result, the Soviet Union rejected the plan and pressured Eastern European countries under its influence to do the same. Instead, it tightened its control over these nations, ensuring that their governments were loyal to Moscow and that their economies followed socialist principles. As these policies took effect, Europe became increasingly divided. Western European countries moved toward economic integration, democratic governance, and close ties with the West. Eastern European countries experienced political repression, centralized economic planning, and limited contact with the West. This growing separation was famously described by Winston Churchill as the Iron Curtain. The term captured both the physical and ideological barriers that were forming across the continent. The Iron Curtain was more than a line on a map. It represented a profound division in how people lived, thought, and interacted with the world. Travel across the divide became difficult or impossible. Information was tightly controlled, especially in Eastern Europe, where governments censored media and restricted access to Western ideas. Families were separated, cultures drifted apart, and suspicion deepened on both sides. The Cold War was no longer just a political rivalry, it was shaping everyday life. As tensions increased, both sides began to formalize their alliances. In 1949, the United States and several of its allies created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, commonly known as NATO. This military alliance was based on the principle of collective defense. If one member was attacked, all members would respond together. The goal was to deter Soviet aggression and ensure the security of Western Europe. The Soviet Union responded by strengthening its own network of alliances. In 1955, it formed the Warsaw Pact, uniting Eastern European countries under a single military command dominated by Moscow. With these alliances in place, the world was now divided into two armed camps. Each side viewed the other as a potential threat, and military planning increasingly focused on preparing for a possible large-scale conflict. Despite this preparation, direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union was avoided. One major reason for this was the presence of nuclear weapons. By the late 1940s, both sides possessed nuclear capabilities, and these weapons fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. A direct conflict between the superpowers risked rapid escalation and unimaginable destruction. Instead of fighting each other directly, they sought to expand their influence through indirect means. This strategy led to the emergence of proxy wars. In these conflicts, local or regional disputes became battlegrounds for the larger Cold War rivalry. One of the earliest and most significant proxy wars took place on the Korean Peninsula. After World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. The northern part of the country was controlled by a communist government supported by the Soviet Union and China. The southern part was backed by the United States and its allies. When war broke out in 1950, it quickly escalated into an international conflict. United Nations forces, led primarily by the United States, intervened on behalf of South Korea. China entered the war to support the North. The fighting was intense and destructive, resulting in millions of deaths. Despite years of combat, the war ended in a stalemate. Korea remained divided, and the border between North and South became one of the most heavily militarized regions in the world. The Korean War demonstrated how the Cold War could turn regional disputes into devastating conflicts without resolving the underlying tensions. While proxy wars unfolded, the Cold War also played out in less visible ways. Intelligence agencies on both sides engaged in espionage, gathering information and attempting to influence foreign governments. Propaganda became a powerful tool, used to shape public opinion at home and abroad. Cultural exchanges, sports competitions, and scientific achievements were often framed as evidence of ideological superiority. Even education and entertainment were influenced by Cold War thinking, as governments sought to promote their values and discredit their rivals. At the same time, the competition extended into science and technology. Both sides invested heavily in research and development, believing that technological superiority could provide strategic advantages. Advances in aviation, computing, medicine, and communications were often linked to military needs. The rivalry also extended beyond Earth, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic competitions of the Cold War, the space race. The space race became one of the most visible symbols of Cold War competition. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. For many in the United States, this moment was deeply unsettling. If the Soviet Union could send an object into space, it could also potentially send nuclear missiles across continents. Sputnik was not just a scientific achievement, it was a psychological victory that suggested Soviet technological superiority. In response, the United States dramatically increased its investment in science, education, and research. New government agencies were created, including NASA, with the goal of ensuring that the United States would not fall behind. The competition soon moved beyond satellites. Both sides aimed to send humans into space, believing that these achievements would demonstrate the strength and intelligence of their systems. When the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit Earth in 1961, it was another major propaganda victory for the Soviet Union. The United States responded with an ambitious goal, landing a human on the moon. Throughout the 1960s, enormous resources were devoted to this effort. Engineers, scientists, and astronauts worked under intense pressure, knowing that success or failure would be seen as a reflection of national power. In 1969, when American astronauts walked on the moon, it marked a turning point in the space race. Although the Cold War continued, the moon landing demonstrated that the United States could match and surpass Soviet achievements in space. While space exploration captured global attention, the most dangerous competition of all was unfolding on Earth. The nuclear arms race accelerated as both sides developed more powerful weapons and more advanced delivery systems. Early nuclear bombs were already devastating, but new technologies made them even more destructive. Hydrogen bombs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and nuclear submarines transformed military strategy. Missiles could now reach targets across the world in minutes, leaving little time for warning or decision-making. This situation led to the development of the doctrine known as mutually assured destruction. The logic was grim but simple. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would respond with equal or greater force. The result would be the destruction of both societies. Because neither side could escape catastrophic loss, neither would dare to start a nuclear war. This balance of terror became the foundation of Cold War stability, even as it placed humanity at constant risk. The fear of nuclear war became a part of everyday life. In the United States, children practiced drills in schools, learning how to hide under desks in case of a nuclear attack. Governments built fallout shelters and issued public guidance on surviving a nuclear explosion. In the Soviet Union, similar preparations took place, often accompanied by strict secrecy and propaganda. Films, books, and news reports reinforced the idea that nuclear war was a real possibility, not a distant threat. The danger of this system became painfully clear during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, American intelligence discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, a country just 90 miles from the United States. From the American perspective, this was unacceptable. Nuclear weapons so close to U.S. territory dramatically reduced warning time and shifted the balance of power. President John F. Kennedy faced immense pressure to respond forcefully. Military leaders urged airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba. At the same time, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev believed the missiles were necessary to protect Cuba and counter U.S. missiles stationed in Europe. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. Military forces were placed on high alert, and ordinary people feared that a single miscalculation could lead to disaster. Ultimately, diplomacy prevailed. Through tense negotiations, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and the United States pledged not to invade the island. In a secret agreement, the United States also removed its own missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended without nuclear war, but it left a lasting impact. Both sides realized how close they had come to catastrophe, and new efforts were made to improve communication and reduce the risk of accidental conflict. One result of this realization was the creation of direct communication channels between Washington and Moscow, including the famous hotline. Arms control agreements followed in later years, aimed at limiting the growth of nuclear arsenals and reducing tensions. While these agreements did not end the Cold War, they reflected a shared understanding that some level of cooperation was necessary to avoid mutual destruction. Despite these efforts, the Cold War continued to shape conflicts around the world. In Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War became one of the most significant and controversial proxy wars. After the division of Vietnam into a communist North and a non-communist South, the United States gradually increased its involvement. American leaders believed that allowing Vietnam to fall to communism would trigger a chain reaction across the region, a theory known as the domino effect. The war in Vietnam was long, complex, and deeply destructive. It involved not only conventional military battles, but also guerrilla warfare, political struggle, and widespread civilian suffering. As the conflict dragged on, public support in the United States began to collapse. Graphic media coverage brought the realities of war into people's homes, fueling protests and social unrest. In the end, despite enormous human and financial costs, the United States withdrew, and Vietnam was unified under communist rule. The Vietnam War had profound consequences beyond Southeast Asia. It damaged trust in government, reshaped American foreign policy, and influenced how future conflicts were approached. It also demonstrated that military power alone could not guarantee success, especially in complex political and social environments. For the Soviet Union in particular, the outcome was seen as evidence that Western influence could be resisted. While Vietnam captured much of the world's attention, Cold War competition also extended to Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Newly independent countries often became arenas for rivalry, as both sides sought allies and influence. In some cases, superpowers supported authoritarian regimes or revolutionary movements, prioritizing strategic advantage over human rights or democratic values. These interventions often led to long-term instability, civil wars, and suffering that lasted well beyond the Cold War itself. In Latin America, fears of communist expansion led the United States to intervene in various ways, including covert operations and support for military coups. In Africa, both superpowers backed rival factions in civil conflicts, supplying weapons and advisors. The Middle East became another critical region where Cold War dynamics intersected with regional rivalries and resource competition. These conflicts demonstrated how the Cold War could intensify local tensions and create lasting consequences. Throughout these decades, propaganda remained a central tool of competition. Governments invested heavily in shaping how their societies understood the world. In the United States, communism was often portrayed as a direct threat to freedom and prosperity. In the Soviet Union, capitalism was depicted as exploitative and unstable. Media, education, art, and culture were all influenced by this rivalry. Even international sporting events, such as the Olympics, became stages for ideological competition. At the same time, the Cold War influenced domestic politics within both superpowers. In the United States, fears of communist infiltration led to periods of intense suspicion and political repression. Accusations of disloyalty could destroy careers and lives. In the Soviet Union, the government maintained tight control over political expression, suppressing dissent and limiting individual freedoms in the name of security and stability. In both systems, fear was used to justify extraordinary measures. As the decades passed, the costs of the Cold War became increasingly apparent. Maintaining massive military forces and nuclear arsenals required enormous resources. For the Soviet Union in particular, these demands placed a heavy burden on an already struggling economy. While the United States benefited from a more flexible and productive economic system, it too faced challenges, including social divisions and the financial strain of prolonged military commitments. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, signs of change began to emerge. In the Soviet Union, economic stagnation and public dissatisfaction made reform increasingly urgent. A new generation of leaders recognized that the existing system was unsustainable. Attempts were made to modernize the economy, reduce tensions with the West, and introduce limited political openness. These reforms were risky and controversial, but they reflected a growing awareness that the Cold War could not continue indefinitely. As tensions eased slightly, dialogue between the superpowers increased. Arms reduction talks, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic meetings became more common.
While distrust remained, there was a growing recognition that cooperation was preferable to endless confrontation. These developments set the stage for the dramatic changes that would soon transform the global order.
By the mid-1980s, it was becoming increasingly clear that the Soviet Union was facing a deep and systemic crisis. Decades of centralized economic planning had failed to deliver the prosperity that had been promised. Factories were inefficient, innovation lagged behind the West, and shortages of basic goods were common. While the Soviet Union continued to project the image of a global superpower, everyday life for many citizens was marked by frustration and uncertainty. The contrast between life in the Eastern Bloc and the consumer abundance visible in Western countries became harder to ignore. In 1985, a new leader came to power in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev represented a break from the past. Younger and more open to change than his predecessors, he believed that reform was essential for the survival of the Soviet system. Gorbachev introduced two major policies that would reshape the Cold War: perestroika, which aimed to restructure the economy, and glasnost, which encouraged greater openness and transparency in government and society. These reforms were intended to strengthen socialism, not dismantle it, but their consequences would prove far-reaching and unpredictable. Perestroika sought to introduce limited market mechanisms into the Soviet economy. Enterprises were given more autonomy, and small-scale private activity was allowed in certain areas. The goal was to improve efficiency and productivity without abandoning socialist principles. Glasnost, meanwhile, reduced censorship and allowed greater freedom of expression. Newspapers began to report on problems that had previously been hidden, including corruption, environmental disasters, and historical injustices. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could openly discuss the shortcomings of their system. These changes had a profound impact, not only within the Soviet Union, but across Eastern Europe. For years, communist governments in the region had relied on Soviet support to maintain power. When it became clear that Moscow was no longer willing to use military force to suppress reform movements, the political landscape began to shift rapidly. One by one, Eastern European countries experienced waves of protest, reform, and revolution. In Poland, an independent labor movement known as Solidarity challenged the authority of the communist government. In Hungary, leaders began dismantling border controls and experimenting with political reform. In East Germany, public demonstrations grew larger and more frequent, fueled by frustration with economic stagnation and restrictions on freedom. The most powerful symbol of this transformation came in 1989, when the Berlin Wall, long a physical and ideological symbol of the Cold War, was opened. Crowds gathered, barriers were breached, and families long separated were reunited. The fall of the Berlin Wall signaled that the division of Europe was coming to an end. As communist governments collapsed across Eastern Europe, the Cold War world order unraveled at an astonishing pace. In many cases, transitions occurred peacefully, though not without tension and uncertainty. For the first time in decades, countries that had been locked into rigid alliances were free to choose their own political paths. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, struggled to manage these changes while dealing with its own internal problems. Within the Soviet Union itself, nationalist movements gained strength.
Republics that had been part of the Soviet state began demanding greater autonomy or outright independence. Economic difficulties worsened and political authority weakened. Attempts to preserve the Union through reform failed to satisfy either hardline communists or reformers. In 1991, a failed coup attempt by conservative elements further destabilized the situation. Later that year, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, bringing an end to the state that had been one of the two pillars of the Cold War.
The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the formal end of the Cold War. For the first time since the end of World War II, the world was no longer divided between two rival superpower blocs. The United States emerged as the dominant global power, and many observers spoke of a new era defined by cooperation, globalization, and the spread of democracy. The fear of immediate nuclear confrontation receded, and military tensions between the former rivals decreased significantly. However, the end of the Cold War did not mean the end of conflict or competition. The legacy of decades of rivalry continued to shape international relations in complex ways. Former communist countries faced enormous challenges as they transitioned to new political and economic systems. Some succeeded in building stable democracies and growing economies, while others struggled with corruption, inequality, and political instability. The sudden shift from centralized planning to market economies created both opportunities and hardships. In Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, the 1990s were marked by economic turmoil and social disruption. Rapid privatization led to the concentration of wealth in the hands of a small group, while many citizens experienced declining living standards. Political institutions were weak, and national identity was in flux. These conditions would later influence Russia's approach to global politics and its relationship with the West. The Cold War also left a lasting imprint on military strategy and international security. Nuclear weapons did not disappear with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Instead, they remained central to the defense policies of several countries. Arms control agreements reduced the number of warheads, but the basic logic of nuclear deterrence persisted. The knowledge that nuclear war was possible, even if unlikely, continued to shape decision-making at the highest levels. Many regional conflicts rooted in Cold War dynamics also continued. The division of Korea remained unresolved, with tensions flaring periodically. In the Middle East, Cold War-era alliances and interventions had contributed to instability that persisted long after the rivalry ended. In parts of Africa and Latin America, the consequences of proxy wars, authoritarian rule, and foreign intervention continued to affect development and governance. Beyond geopolitics, the Cold War influenced culture, technology, and social attitudes in lasting ways. Advances driven by competition, such as space exploration, computing, and communications technology, became part of everyday life. The Internet, satellite systems, and modern electronics all benefited from research originally motivated by military and strategic concerns. At the same time, decades of propaganda and ideological conflict left deep psychological and cultural scars. For many people who lived through the Cold War, the period was defined by a constant sense of uncertainty. The possibility of nuclear war shaped how individuals thought about the future, family, and survival. Films, literature, and art reflected these anxieties, exploring themes of apocalypse, surveillance, and ideological struggle.
Even after the Cold War ended, these themes remained part of popular culture, reminding new generations of a time when the fate of the world seemed perpetually at risk. In retrospect, the Cold War can be seen as a paradoxical era. On one hand, it was marked by fear, division, and immense suffering, particularly in regions caught in proxy conflicts. On the other hand, the very danger of nuclear war may have prevented direct conflict between the superpowers. The balance of terror forced restraint, even as it pushed humanity to the brink. The Cold War demonstrated both the destructive potential of modern technology and the capacity of political systems to avoid catastrophe through caution and negotiation. Understanding the Cold War is essential for understanding the modern world. Many today's international institutions, alliances, and rivalries were shaped by decisions made during this period. The distrust between certain countries, the persistence of military blocs, and the ongoing importance of nuclear weapons all have roots in Cold War history. Even debates about globalization, national sovereignty, and ideological identity can be traced back to the lessons and legacies of this era. The Cold War did not end with a decisive victory on a battlefield. Instead, it faded as one system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. This outcome challenged assumptions about power, ideology, and historical inevitability. It showed that economic strength, political legitimacy, and adaptability matter as much as military might. It also demonstrated that change, once it begins, can unfold rapidly and unpredictably. Today, the world faces new challenges and new forms of rivalry. While the Cold War is over, competition between major powers has not disappeared. Technology, influence, and ideology remain sources of tension. The history of the Cold War offers valuable lessons about the dangers of escalation, the importance of communication, and the need to balance competition with cooperation. It reminds us that global stability depends not only on strength, but on restraint and understanding. The Cold War shaped the second half of the 20th century in profound ways. It defined how nations interacted, how societies organized themselves, and how individuals understood their place in the world. Its legacy continues to influence politics, security, and culture in the 21st century. By studying this period, we gain insight into both the risks and possibilities of global power, and into the choices that can lead either to destruction or to survival.